My folks come in there in 1855.
And what, were you born back there?
Yeah, I was born. I was born in Northfield, Minnesota, where the Jesse James stuck up the bank here and got shot up.
In what year?
1876.
In what year were you born?
I was born in 1898.
When did you move here?
1908.
To Nelson?
I was 10 years old then. I've been here almost 72 years.
When did you first get your job as a cabin boy on the sternwheeler?
I was never a cabin boy. They didn't have cabin boys on these sternwheelers. They were deckhands and things like that. The first job I had was the Dominion Express as a messenger on there that handled the mail and the baggage and the express and local shipments into town from the stump ranchers. See, it wasn't very much going, and there was no roads then. It was all, the boat just rubbed up on the beach then.
Which boat was that?
Well, the Kuskanook then, that I was on. But the Moye, of course, she was much earlier than that, and that Kuskanook had just been taken off of, see now, wait a minute. See, they had built the Nisukan then, in 1913, and they took the Kuskanook off the landing one, Kootenay landing one, and put now that one on there, and the Kootenay was retired shortly after that. She ran, I think the Kootenay ran into the 20s, and the Kuskanook one was some around, I don't know, I can get the dates if you need them.
Well, how old were you when you got that job?
I was 18.
So it was 1916.
Yeah. Because I only run there, I run there from the time the raspberries come in the spring, in the summer, until the fruit run was over. You see, all fruit went to the prairies those days. And this was quite a fruit growing, small fruits, you know. And all went to prairie because you couldn't bring it in from the coast then. And they weren't probably developed there so much. Now, of course, they have put them right out of business in this country. But they needed 2 messengers on that run, and they used to go out. They were out 3 days and laid over 3 days, out 3 days and laid over 3 days, and so I got the run that the fella had that went on the Crow Run.
On the what?
The Crow Run, on the Crow's Nest. Mm-hmm. See, they went through the Medicine Hat. Then they changed over there.
So would you actually be on rail barges or?
No. These were passenger boat and freight.
Mm-hmm. But it was connected with the rail line.
Well, it run from Caslo, laid over at Caslo, and it came down to Nelson every morning. And then it left here at 4 o'clock, and it went back up to Caslo, and twice a week they went to Lardeau and Argenta, Johnson's Landing, Shutty Bench, and those places. Mm-hmm. And then in the morning, if you had passengers, anything from Caslo, Caslo was the greatest cherry growing place there was in Canada, I believe, at one time. She had the biggest cherries and the nicest cherries until this here small cherry disease got in. That put her on the bum. Well, they were shipping cherries, and we would meet the Nisukan going to the landing at Proctor, and if we were a little late, sometime we made the transfer in the middle of the lake. Mm-hmm. Boats pulled up alongside of one another, transferred passengers and baggage and freight and express. Well, I was on the Kuskanook. She come in here. She used to leave Caslo at 5:30 in the morning. And then she got into Nelson somewhere around 9, 9:30, 10 o'clock, something like that. They weren't on the minute, you know. They weren't like a train was supposed to be those days. And then she'd pull out at 4 o'clock, and she would go to Caslow. She'd be there around 8:30 or something like that. And then Lardeau night, of course, it was real late when they got up there and got back to Caslow. Of course, when we went back from Caslow, from Argenta going back, everybody got to bed then. They didn't stay up because there was nothing there to do. Outside of the deckhands that had to help make the landing and the firemen, engineer and that, yeah.
You did that just for 1 year then?
Oh no, I only did this for about 6 months. Then I was bumped off.
In the winter tie-up?
Well, they didn't tie up, but the boats didn't tie up, but the fruit run was over, you see, and there wasn't the fruit going on these express cars. They had 2 express cars full of them, or fruit, and it had to be hurried there before it went rotten or soft or something so they could peddle it. Well, when the fruit run was over in the fall, I was laid off because the fellow come back on his own run. That was his run. He had priority. Well, I didn't do nothing then for, it was getting on February, and then I joined the Army.
Did you go overseas?
Yeah. I was overseas for about 2 years, almost 2 years and a half. And when I come back, I went in and looked around the express office here, and everything had changed, and I walked out of her and never went back. So then I become a lumberjack. That was all it was. You could have been a miner. You didn't have education enough to take an office job, so you had to do something else.
You had gone to secondary school in Nelson?
What do you mean, secondary school?
High school?
No. It was only the rich people that went to high school. Yeah, they don't know how many kids. I don't suppose there are more than, but quite a lot of girls went there, and people that had money, they went there. But at that time, we had gone broke.
Right, that was right before the war? Right before the war.
Yeah, my stepfather, he went and bought a steamboat, and it didn't pan out that way, and of course then he was going to take on this fruit run.
Contract to the CPR?
Well, not contracts. He was on his own. He was going to pick up, because the CPR wouldn't pick their stuff up those days along the river with a passenger boat going to the Crow's Nest, because it slowed them down, and they didn't make the time to get to the landing. So he was going to do that. So he quit the CPR then, and so he bought this little steamboat, a little stern-wheeler called the Creston, and he went broke on it. So we were on the bum then. So,
had you worked with him on the boat?
No, I was only a kid. I was, at that time, I was only about 11 years old. I wouldn't be much good around a boat, would I?
What did you do after you got out of the Army?
I became a lumberjack. I worked around the booms and on tugboats, and I worked on surveys as an axeman, and then I got to be a rodman, and I was on the timber surveys. The first survey I was ever on was on timber surveys in Lardeau in 1919.
Why were they surveying the timber up there?
Well, they were surveying to see how much it was.
Who was doing the survey?
Oh, H. Green. They were surveyors and engineers that had an office here in town those days. Green Brothers and Burden. They were old-time surveyors here. That is, they had an old-time office. Old H. Green. They were New Brunswickers, and they were pretty well hooked up back there, I guess, in that country. But because F.C. Green, that was old H.'s brother, he became Surveyor General of British Columbia. And Burden, he got into politics, and he was the minister in London there for, I can't think what it was now, if it was commerce or some damn thing like that, because I remember when he come back, he was looking for things to probably had access to some money or some investors over there that wanted him to find some place they can put some money in and make a lot of money or something. But then he went back to surveying. See, they had an office one time in Prince George, and one in Victoria and one in Nelson. And the old Fred Burden, he did the survey on the town of Prince George, or Fort George then. Yeah, that was the original survey. That was probably just before the war, because everything shut down in that time during the First War, you know, like the Grand Trunk and the Canadian Northern and that, they were sort of competing against each other going through the Yellowhead, and they went broke, of course.
Well, who was paying for the survey for you to be up there surveying the timber, and why were they?
These people that held the timber.
Had they held the timber for very long?
Oh yeah, you see, prior to 1905, I could get a job for somebody that had money to buy timber, or and I could go and stake a timber block. And if I went out and I went up a creek and it wasn't staked or anything, I could go and stake out. Say there was 5 limits and I staked 10, I got more money. See, they got so much a limit for staking. Well, gee, some of them creeks, they was about twice as much staked as there was on the creek. Of course, there was fires that dug into it by this time. But then they were paying $100 and something per limit for taxes to the Forest Service, and they began to wonder if they had that timber. And they went up there and had a compass lines run on it, which was accurate enough for any timber survey, because the boundaries, if they varied as much as a few hundred feet one way or the other, didn't mean nothing. Because when you would log it, you would take it anyhow. But anyway, there were a lot of them creeks that didn't have what they figured they had, you know, a long ways from it. But the forestry then, you see, they wondered what the hell was up, because there was so much difference in the number of limits. That's why it was done it. But I don't know who they paid for it. There was all kinds of different holders that held that. See, it was the big blocks in the bottom, I think, were held by the Kootenay Cedar, and that was some outfit in New York. I guess you've heard of that, haven't you?
It was a Smith-Kenna company.
Yeah, Smith-Kenna, yeah, that's right. They were New Yorkers, I think. Because I remember there'd only been a little bit of dabbling in the logging business up there at that time. And the cruisers used to come in and look at the timber, but none of them wanted to take it on because they figured it was pretty rotten. But as you got out of the bottom of the older timber, it got better on the side hills and that. And now they go into timber and get what they can, and the big cedar shells are pretty valuable now, where they weren't at that time, because you could go any place and get that stuff. Yeah, gee, this whole bottom from here clean to the boundary and down from Salmo to Nelway was all timber when I was a kid. Right down to the track. Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know who pays for all these things, but I guess they got paid. I guess probably that was, some of it was land grants up there, very likely Crown land. The Crown granted stuff, you know, the same as all this timber south of here was belonged to the Nelson Fort Shepherd Railroad for putting the railroad in. The same thing happened on the Crow's Nest, the CPR got her. And they're coming across the prairie, the CPR got every other alternate township free. That's what they sold them when they had the big immigration, you know, around 1908, 7, 8, 9, 10, along in there, when all these here Europeans come out there and homesteaded. Mm-hmm. They take 160 acres if they could stick it out. But there was nothing. When I was a kid, you could look out over the prairie, you couldn't see nothing. The only place there was people was at the divisional point. And that's not long ago.
Can you describe the Lardeau Valley as you first remember it?
Well, I would say that it was more or less of an isolated place. And at that time, there was a terrific snowfall there, more so than there is now. I've seen 2 feet of snow right there at Meadow Creek. That is good set snow. And there wasn't too many people there. The mill shut down there at Girard. They logged on Trout Lake. And the hatchery was there in 1912 to help the fish population in Kootenay Lake, which was a good thing, but there was never anything put back in there. They robbed the darn thing. And of course, with that and with these fish derbies, is an awful darn drain on this lake, and importing all the people from all over the world to come and get them big fish, and there aren't any anymore, hardly. There's not many. You can take care at Girard. When I was up there 30 years ago, there probably was 5,000 fish there at one time. Now, if there's 500 come there the whole season, that's pretty about all, and they're afraid that it's overcrowded now. So I don't know. It seems to be a washout there. The hatchery was just beyond the staff house there, that building that's still standing. It was well finished too. They had indoor plumbing and everything there, you know. And there was hydrants in there. That's when the mill was running. That was when the town was better. And then after the mill shut down, they did a lot of pole making on the lake, and the railroad was still in, and they used to load poles out there. And there was several. Old man Newcomen had several camps along there. This here is in the earlier 20s, you know. And Poplar at that time had maybe 25 people around there. And there was 2 hotels, and Gold Hill had a hotel there. You know where Gold Hill is. And Teddy Allen was still in there, and the Hinkses were over there at Duncan Lake on the east side there, and Simpson was there. And there was the trappers were there at Hauser, and there was Bertie Ward and Board it was, and Tim Ainsworth and who the hell, I guess there was another Bertie Ward and Tim Ainsworth. There was a fellow one time there by the name of Mullock there at Hauser, and up on the lake there at South Bay there were the 2 Matthews brothers. They ranched there. They'd come in there early when the time of the boom, and they figured that if they raised vegetables and things, they could sell it to this big mining development up the Duncan, but which never materialized and all that.
Had they cleared a lot of land?
Oh, they did. They had a good fruit ranch and gardens and everything. They got killed with bears up there, one of them did. I guess you've heard of that. I guess Ernie Alexander would know more about that than me, because he would know that because he was right there. But I remember the time. I remember meeting him. Oh, this was 50 years ago. We went up to Duncan and we outfitted there with vegetables, spuds and onions and stuff. And, you know, carrots and anything that you could use on a survey party. See, there was, when we went up there, there was about 8 or 9 of us. And we had a cook and everything. We had a tent camp, you know, wherever we went, unless there was a cabin. But then since that, they've logged up there on the Duncan and drove the river down. But none of them seemed to make very good there. There's always a problem until we begin to get better roads in there and can truck and get back in. Well, those days they couldn't because it was only a horse chance. There was no road up the Duncan at that time. And then they flooded the place and they covered up an awful good wildlife sanctuary there. A fellow named George McGinnis, he logged up in there.
Who was he?
He was a logger. He was around. He's dead now. He was a good logger, good operator, a good fellow besides. Ernie could probably tell you about him because he would be up there. He would probably been over there and knew him. But George was a good fella.
Did you work for him?
No, I didn't, but I scaled a lot of his logs. One time he was operating over at Summit Lake on the Slocan, you know, between the cusp and over on the hump there. And he railed in a bunch of white pine to the company I was working for, and I unloaded the cars and scaled them and boomed them, sorted them. Then he went broke up in the Lardeau, and he went over into East Kootenay, and he went to East Kootenay, and he got operating there, and he made a lot of money. Yeah. And the fellows he had to work for him, they all appreciated him, and he trusted them, and that was probably one of the best run logging camps that I know of. He didn't go out checking them and doubting their word or anything. But he picked his men. They were all good lumberjacks.
Were they mostly Swedish?
No. Some of them, a lot of them were French. You know, French lumberjacks that had been around here for a long time. I knew some of them. Some of them were, I don't know what the hell some of them must be, you know. But, well, the Swedes, they were pretty good loggers. That is, more in the pole business. They seemed to be more pole makers in those days. But you don't find them anymore. Because there was no pole making. See, those days you peel them in the woods. Now you take them out with a bark on them, turn them, and they ship them to a pickling plant, and they're turned and pickled and reshipped and all that. It's a different proposition, but they were a better pole than they make out today, because those days they made the poles in the wintertime when the sap was down and they didn't check like the ones they have today. See, you knock the bark out off when it peels easy in the spring. Gee, you can almost take a hold of a piece of bark at one end and give her a pull and it'll come off to the other. So that's the way it went. But they took the Lardeau country. They took out a lot of poles, an awful lot of poles. Even when Kootenay Forest got in there, they took out a lot of poles. And they took out quite a lot of white pine out of there, too.
Where did the white pine go?
They'd come into the factory here as a rule. If the small operators, they could deal with the WW Powell company. They were a match block factory. They just bought the pine and they remilled it and seeded it and remilled it and cut it into match links in blocks. and the knot was chopped out, or any defect. It had to be straight grain, and they were shipped in carloads to different match companies, like the Canadian Match and the Eddie Match and the Diamond Match and Ohio Match. They were Diamond and Ohio. They were across the line, and they even shipped match blocks to England, and sometime, not many, but they shipped them even to South Africa.
Were they small pieces then?
Well, they were just the length of a match, depending on what kind the order was. If it was a household match, a great long one with a big long handle on it, the ones that come in the little boxes and all that. Mm-hmm. It depended on what the order was, what they cut it. They had quite a factory here. They employed about somewhere 20, 30 girls chopping the knots and stain and wormholes and crooked grain out. Mm. And then they sold this waste to people at so much a unit. And it only, well, I can remember you bought a truckload for $5. The greatest wood in the world.
For kindling?
Well, in the summer time it was good for cooking. Mm-hmm. You put on your kettle and you could boil the kettle in a few minutes, and because it was dry pine, and the fire went out and they didn't heat your house up. Mm-hmm. People missed those things when they went away. Mm-hmm. But that was cheap fuel.
Were they also making lumber?
Oh yeah, they used their, see, all pine wood wasn't matchstock. They run it through sorting, and they graded it and everything, and the stuff that was too hard, fiber in it, that didn't go. The best timber was the second growth that was probably run about 8 logs to 1,000.
Smaller then?
Well, that's just better than what they got today, you know. And the big logs, the outfit sawed that into shop lumber. Oh, they made it as wide as they could, and it was generally in 5/4, 6/4, and something like that. Or probably dimension 2 inch. And that was all the clears, and that went back east to the pattern making and steelworks, where they used that for making patterns. Mm. That was expensive stuff, but you could buy lumber at that time for $27 1,000. Just lumber, like shiplap and rustic and stuff of that, 2x4s, all that was good building lumber. Yeah.
Were they also logging spruce and fir and hemlock?
Well, they didn't bother about that much because they were a white pine outfit. They were match blocks. There was all the other outfits they had, and lots of these here outfits that had mixed logs. They would sort their pine out and send it to Powell's. Mm-hmm. That was the kind of see the Powell, WW Powell had a factory here. Matchbox factory had one in Spokane too, and they logged too besides at one time over across the line. And they logged over here too, over on Lost Creek they took out.
Were there big company camps in the Lardeau?
Well, no, there was no big companies out of that layout that was in Girard. That was a big outfit there, but of course they went out of business. But until the Kootenay Forest got in there, that was the biggest outfit. These other ones, I imagine, they probably didn't cut more than 30,000 feet. You see.
Who owned the mill here before KFP?
Oh, on this ground it was a different mill, of course. It's bigger now and been overhauled. The first mill that was built there was built by Schaefer Hitchcock. They were from Sand Point. And then there was a fellow by the name of Patterson had it. I don't know if he were working for Schaefer Hitchcock or not. But I scaled there two summers in the mill there, had white pine. And I worked on when they built that booming ground there. I worked on the pile driver and tugboat when they put them in, and the skipper on the tugboat and we put in the storm booms and everything, got it ready to receive logs when they started the mill. That's quite a while ago though now, I guess.
Was there a company called Glacier Logging or
Pardon?
Glacier Logging or Glacier Lumber Company?
Yeah.
Who were they?
That was the outfit that this Patterson was working for. Yeah. They had a layout out here at Creston Valley too one time. Yeah, Glacier, that's right. I was trying to think of that. Then Deer Park took it over.
Deer Park?
Yeah, that was Luthal. They were over at Deer Park, Washington. They had it. And that's where they built the bigger mill. They rebuilt it. And then Eddie Match bought the Powell factory. And they shut that down, and they had that mill. And then they unloaded it onto what's Kootenay Forest now, or I think they sold it to the government. As near as I can remember that.
So Powell's was a Houghton Powell was a separate mill. It was in a different location than where
The WW Powell was down here where at the foot of Stanley Street. You know where that is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right there, almost Stanley, right at the foot of Stanley Street there. That's where their place was. And these mills that sawed white pine for them, they just financed them. They didn't have no interest in them. They give them so much $1,000.
Did Glacier Lumber have a large camp in the Lardeau logging?
No, not that I know of, but they logged over on Crawford Creek in Crawford Bay. They had a camp up in there.
Has the Lardeau always been a major source of timber for the mills in Nelson?
No.
That's only recently then.
Yeah, that's more recent. They've logged, in the old days, they used to get an awful lot of timber up around the Kootenay Flats up there on the east side and places like that. There was not much logging on the side creeks on Kootenay Lake until, say, the last 20 years or something like that. To go really into the valley much was in 1990 on the timber survey. And at that time, of course, yes, right after the war, and there wasn't too much there. There was the old Matthews place there at Meadow Creek, and there was the old Chris Marsden place there, and he had some cattle at Meadow Creek. That's the place that, I don't know who has it now. It's on that big meadow that Howland was on, you know, where he built that house out there. And Chris Martin was there, and the first time I was there, they were making hay out there on those meadows. And it was all full of haycocks. And then I went on up, and the Marblehead was running then. At Marblehead, that is where that Kootenay Forest have their camp.
Mm-hmm.
That was running. They were cutting marble there. I don't know where they were shipping it to, but a fellow named Wilson, I think, was the one that was the manager. I knew a few of them fellows there. And Newcomen was in the valley then. He did a little logging. Yeah, and taking out poles.
On his own?
Yeah, on Harry. I don't know. I don't know, but I've heard this, that he used to do a lot of trespassing. He was supposed to be the looking after some limits belonging to the home bank, and he used to log them as if it was his own. Did you ever hear that one? Well, I don't know how much is in it, but anyway, he hadn't gone, but his boy is back in Canada now, the young Henry. He's not young anymore, he's about my age, I guess. Anyway, his old man was quite a guy.
Do you remember meeting anybody who had been in the area right from the beginning of the railway boom and the mining boom? Were there people that still lived there?
Well, I knew several guys that were there when they built the railroad. There was an old fellow here in town, he's dead a long time now. He was there when they were making that fill across the meadows there at Meadow Creek. He worked on that and he prospected in there. I guess this was back in the 90s sometime. I couldn't tell you what year it was. Probably Johnson that had the store and his sister had the hotel there at Poplar probably was some of the earliest ones. They came in there from over in the Tulameen. He was there at the time of the rush. That's when they built all those hotels. There was 8 hotels, I believe. That's what wee Scotty told me.
Who is that?
Wee Scotty Wilson, that was the mail carrier from Lardo to Girard before the railroad. There was Marblehead, and then there was Teddy Evans. He lived at Bosworth. That was where he lived. That's the name of the station. It was just a little box, I think, on a tree or something, or a sign there, Bosworth. Then you got up to Gold Hill, and the rears, they had that. That was, I don't know how they made a living, but there was a certain amount of prospectors went up there. And then you kept on and going, you got to Poplar. That was the boom town. I guess an awful lot of them fellows had come in there in the boom, you see, because that was only 25 years after the boom, practically. And they still had claims. They always going to strike it rich, but whether they did or not. There was a fellow there, Dick Roberts. He was quite a windbag, but he was a comedian or something in the old country on the stage at one time. Not many people know that, but I met him there. I don't know what happened to him. He stayed at Johnson's place there at Poplar. And there was the Hansons. They had the other hotel there at that time. Oh yeah. I'm going to tell you about this commercial hotel. Old Johnny McLaughlin run that in Lardo. And this was right after the war. This is the time I went up there on the timber survey, another kid and I. And he used to sell elderberry wine over the bar. The country was dry, see. And this was boat day. There was no railroad or road then. And you go up there and get 2 shots for a quarter, them old-time whiskey glasses. You know what they're like. Anyway, and a bottle only cost you $1.25. Well, this stuff was, he used to give the people up the valley $1 a barrel for elderberries, because up there in the flats was just full of berries. Then he'd send over to Alberta and he used to get straight alcohol. And then he started this wine, and when it got worked to be wine, it didn't have enough alcohol. He used to spike it with this alcohol. And the boat crew, they used to get pretty well teed up there. I got steamed up there one time. Another kid and I went up on the train then to Poplar. And boy, was I sick. But anyway, that was just one of them. And going back up the valley again, Poplar, I say, had about 25 people there with high boots, big hats, and beards, a lot of them. Of course, they had meals though in the hotels there. Dinner time, breakfast time, supper time, everything, you know. Served meals. I don't know what they cost anymore. But from then on up, there was really nothing, only a couple of small logging camps where they were taking out poles, mostly Newcomans. Yeah. There was one at 28 Mile. They loaded a lot of poles there at Girard at the time to come off the lake, and the little boats, you know, just small boats would tow them in there and they'd pull them out. Because they boats like the Proctor, they were gone off of there at that time, off the lake. The CPR pulled out, and the old Victoria was gone. I don't know what happened to her. But
Could you describe a log drive from start to finish? Where you started and what you did all the way down until you got the logs to the lake? How you worked and tools you used and techniques you applied to?
Well, you can to an extent, but I never was on a big drive. I generally got around the boom because I was caddy on my feet and I could work on the logs. But I drove the Lardeau from one time. There was 5 of us come from Marblehead down, but the logs were put in the river and they were never a boom put at the mouth, and they just winged up along the shore. So the ones that did go through went out into the lake and had to be picked up again. But a log drive, if it was run properly, was they cut the logs and sleigh hauled them or sloop hauled them with horses. This is the days of horses. And they dumped them over the bank. In lots of places they built proper landings where they had skids under them and they were decked high. Because if you put the logs in, just dumped them in, the river stayed open, they got away, and hard to tell where they went to. But they would break down these skidways when the water started to come in the spring. They generally did in the spring when the water was cold, just at the freshet. They had to go down mostly on the freshet. They'd break down these skidways where they were decked and roll them into the water, and then as they followed them down, they had to rear them, and they would wing up on what they called wings with side jams on a curve, probably. They winged up there, something held them, or an old tree was in there, or roots was upended, and they'd hang up there, and it'd make quite a wing there. Sometimes they would jam right across the rivers, and you'd have to get in there and pick them, and lots of times they used powder on them. But then there was the fellows that went down with a floating bunch, and keep them moving, you see, and they'd put men along at bad spots where they lived with PVs and pike poles. They all wore cork shoes, of course. They couldn't work otherwise, and stag pants. Because you stagged them, you didn't have that old wet stuff flopping around your feet, you know, and to get your corks caught in it and all that. And they wore underclothes too, because they couldn't have stood the water if they didn't. And well, when they get a wing up there, they would get working on it, and they would try to open it so that the river could get in behind it. And that would push it out into the river by the, you see, maybe there was 100,000 or so in this, you see. Maybe it was blocking up the river too, you see, and making the water flood down back of the jam. Well, then they would get the thing moving again, and then there would be the guys that were what they call rearing. They were going down any logs, that stray logs that was hanging up, they would roll them in and follow them down. Oh, some of them drives, like over on the Kettle River, would have 25, 30 men on them, and over on the Slocan, when they used to drive, they would have a bunch of men on them.
But the ones in the Duncan were smaller?
Oh yeah, they never had more than, I don't know, maybe a half a dozen men. Yeah, that I know of. At the time I went, there was only 5 of us. We had one boat. We had a river boat. Put it in at Marblehead.
Was that something that was built locally?
Yeah, old man Morrell built it. He was looking after the sort of caretaker there at the marble works at that time. It was a pointer. It was I don't know. You know what a pointer is? One that's a double-ended. Yeah. It was a double-ender, and you could put 2 sets of oars on it. And we had an old-timer of a boatman there. By golly, of course, he was pretty well up in years at that time, because he told me in 1898 he had been as far as James Bay with the Hudson Bay Company as a boatman. So I guess he's dead now. He was a great one with a boat, though. And we drove down the river there, and got them right down to Lardeau. We had a big side jam in the river there, about maybe a half a mile or so above Mosquito Landing. We'd come out. Of course, the river was over on the roadside, where those piling are. That's where we had the boom in. But on them big drives, they had a lot of men, and there were probably 3 or 4 different logging outfits there, and they all had bark marks on them. They were like notches in the bark. It'd be like one guy would have 3 notches. That would be one company. Another one would have 2 notches. Another one would have 1 notch. And when they got them down to where they boomed them up, they would have a sorting gap, and the fellows working on the sod, they hooked their gaff on their pike pole underneath and rolled it over to see what mark it had on it. See, this notch might be on the underside. So then they shoved it into that pocket or into that pocket. That's the way they got it. I remember it being an association drive over on Mosquito Creek on the Lardeau, not the Lardeau, but on Arrow Lakes. There was the Wesley Lumber Company and the Edgewood Lumber Company. That was Waldy and Sons. And they drove the creek. It wasn't a big drive, but I suppose they got down maybe 8 or 10 million out of her. And they had a sorting gap down just below Burton City. And they had paint on the ends. They put one had, I don't remember just what they had, 1 mark or 2 mark, or maybe the other one had an X, or maybe it had 4 dots or something like that. They had just cheap, I suppose, red ochre and oil or something, and they made these dabs of these old brushes or a swab or something. I remember that one. I was over at Edgewood one time on the Earl Lakes, and Lindsay Brothers took a drive out of there of just cedar poles. And they had a big shore boom there. There was quite a bunch of guys there. There must have been about 20, 25 on that drive, but the river was very crooked. The Innanochlan means crooked river in Indian. Yeah. Just the same as incomplex means no fish. That's, where the incomplex is. Up the head of the lake on the north arm. Yeah. Does that kind of cover what you were thinking about?
Yes. I wanted to ask you if you knew Red McLeod.
Yeah, I knew him very well.
Could you tell me a little bit about him?
Well, I didn't think he was an awful man, but he wasn't a bad old guy. I didn't know him when he was on the jump, but I knew him after that. I knew him about 50 years ago. And he used to call me the kid. I would meet him. He had a pair of eyes. He could look straight ahead, yet he was studying you, and sober as anything. Fine-looking man, a real old Westerner. I think he was born back in Ontario in Glengarry, and he came to this country pretty early. Him and his brother. He had a brother over there around Fort Steele someplace. And he drove horse stage on the Caribou Road. with old man Taggart. The Taggarts still live in East Kootenay. They're the old big family there. They had a reunion, there was over 400 come to it. So they were cow punchers and everything, horse thieves, and et cetera, and bronc busters and that. Anyway, Red, he used to steal horses. He was a good horseman. There's one story about him in the time of Duncan City. That's over on Duncan Lake when they had a boom there, and there was hotels there and that. He stole a bunch of horses, and at that time the Great Northern was going in, and the CPR in there, the railroad. Old Red, he stole a bunch of horses across over in East Kootenay, and he run them up through Earl Grey Pass and down into the Kootenay. And he sold them to some outfit there, I don't know who, at pack horses. And he took the money and he went down to Canada. Was a boom town then too. There was quite a population there. And he blew the money. And then he come back and he stole the horses again from the fellow I saw him, sold them to another outfit. Whether it was he sold them first to the Great Northern and stole them and then sold them to the CPR, I don't know. But that's what he did, and he is the fellow that discovered, him and a fellow named McDonald, discovered the Lavina mine up at Lavina Lookout. You ever been up there?
Yeah.
You ever see the workings there?
Just from the air.
Tunnels and that?
No, I've never been on the...
No. Well, he's the guy that discovered that, and they split it. They got $14,000, which is a fortune those days. I don't know what McGlobble did, but I met McDonald's boy once. That's how I knew it with McDonald, and he was Red's partner. And I don't know how Red come to be up in there, whether he was on the jump or hiding out. But anyway, he took his $7,000 and he went down to Caslo and he blew it. They had a big honky-tonk there. You've heard of that, have you?
No.
It was called the Comique. It was a 3-story honky-tonk. They did the drinking below and the gambling, and the women were up above. And that's where he unloaded the money in 2 weeks. But he got into jail in Golden one time. No, just before I tell that, I'll tell you about how he got to the Lardeau. He was on the jump. I don't know what he had done or anything, but he was on the jump and the Mounties were looking for him. And he came into Sandland. And I knew this fellow that told me this. He was a 4-horse man. And they were hauling there for some of the mines or ore. And he was at this place. I don't know what mine it was. And the Mountie come into the superintendent's office there, and he said, "Is a fellow named Norman McLeod here?" The fellow said, "Yes." He says, I'm looking for him. So the guy, it was either noon or breakfast or something. Anyway, the men filed into the cookhouse. And this fellow said to this Mountie, he says, "Do you see your man?" He says, "Yes." He says, "I'll get him when he comes out." Red never came out. He went right through the cookhouse and out the back door, and the next time they saw anything of him, he was in the Lardeau. I think that was the time he got there. Yeah, I don't know what year that was, but I couldn't tell you, but because it was old stiff-armed Jack McDonald that told me this. He was a great friend of mine, too. And, but he broke jail for something or other in Golden. And by golly, he stole a horse there, and he came right down. There was a lot of logging camps along the river because they used to put the logs in the river and catch them down at Wardener. And he'd just pushing the horse, by golly, till he had to have a new horse. He'd ride right into a camp and tell him, "I'm Red McLeod, and I need some grub and I need another horse," and he swapped saddles. Yeah, and that's how Tattaquik got named. You know where Tattaquik is?
It's in the East Kootenay, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just almost across the river from the Kootenay on the west side from Wassa. And already they were closing in on them, and the Mounties were crowding them, and they had a couple of Indians, trackers with them, and Red's horse was done. And by golly, he ran back in there in the clearing, and he started a fire, and of course, then he hid. And they went out to look around the fire and feel around and see how quick it was. And Red, he went back and stole their horses. Yeah, and he kept on going, and he went into the camp, so I'm Red McLeod, and I need another horse. And they gave it to him. Nobody ever argued a doggone big. And he made her into Montana. Well, they couldn't touch him then, and he monkeyed around down. He got into a jackpot down there, and they were crowding him pretty hard. This was a long time back now, and by golly, he was making for Alberta out of Montana. And they were crowding him. By golly, they caught up to him, and some way or other he got the drop on the sheriff, and he got him off and took his gun away from him and took his horse and put the fellow away on foot, and he made her into Alberta. Well, they couldn't touch him then again. So then he made the big circle, and I think that was the time that he came into Sandland. But the fellow that knew all of his, pretty well of his playing around was Harry Thomason. He was a good friend of me. He was a forest ranger, but Harry's dead now, and he never wrote it up or told anybody. But Harry was pretty close-mouthed. You know, I knew him. I knew him when he came in the country. But he also broke jail at Grand Forks. And I don't know where else he broke jail, but it was probably from taking something. But on the other hand, he wasn't a bad guy. Some people say he was. He got mean when he was drunk, but I don't know if he did or not. But when I was a kid, there was bars. There was some 22 or 23 bars here run night and day. And there was one they called the Bodega. And of course, these people that knew Red, they knew him. They knew he was a hard man. And he was drinking. And there was a fellow by the name of... he went by the name of Hanna. They called him Jawbone Hanna. I don't know if he was a boomer or what he was, but he thought he could make a reputation by taking a fall out of Red, and he hit him in the bar, and Red was pretty drunk, and he knocked him down, and Red hit his head, the back of his head on the bar, the footrail, the old bar, and he was unconscious for over a week. They thought he'd killed him. Well, they never did find this guy again, and nobody ever heard of him after that. But that kind of slowed Red down. But he would give you anything. I remember one time him and Sammy Luffman. Sammy lived in Hauser, and him and Red had a little pole job from old man Newcomen down along the river there at Meadow Creek, and Bob Matheson was driving team for old man Newcomen, and they got a carload of feed in, and Bob was unloading it, and he said, old man Newcomen asked him, he said, pretty near got that unloaded. Yeah, he said, I said about another load. He has so much bale, hail, so many sacks, so stuff like that. Well, he said, you might as well leave them there, he said, because Red McLeod is jippoing down by the river, and he said he must be about out of feed for his horses now. So he said he'd only come and take it anyhow. But one time down in Caswell, they tell this story about him. It was the time of the boom, and things had gone flop. And there was a lot of fellows in there, the married men with kids and that. And there was Chinamen down in where the park is down in there. That was where the Chinamen lived. And they had a garden and they raised pigs and stuff down in there. And Red was in town and he talking to this fellow that he knew. And the fellow said, by golly, I don't know what I'll do. He says, things are going bad. And he said, I haven't got a job. I got the kids. And the Chinamen, they'd just been butchering some pigs down there. So, by golly, next morning, if there wasn't a pig hanging in the back of this guy's woodshed, already gone down, that was a good act, just the same. But it doesn't do the Chinaman any good, but that wasn't too bad a thing. That was, yeah, but he lived over on the Hinks place there for a long time, across from Hauser on the east side, and the place burned down. I don't know why, but then George McGinnis donated enough lumber and hauled it down to, you see there was the road on the east side, down to Argenta, and you know where his shack was there, do you? Well, they built that shack for him, and old Jack, that's where he wound up his last days there.
Why did they go way down there to build it?
Well, it was better for him. He was out there and he'd be looked after. Up at Hauser there was nothing. But anyway, they used to call him the mayor of Argenta at one time. I've heard him called that. And he was always there on the boat when the boat came in. That's where I've seen him. But then what happened to him in his late years, while he was there, he got a saddle horse and he went up to Lavina to look for some ore that he claimed had been mined and never taken out. This was when lead was high. What was that? This was my hearing aid.
Oh.
When you put your hand close, it whistled. And that's where he began to go down the hill. Of course, he was a man over 80 then. But his saddle horse got away on him while he was prowling around, and he couldn't catch it. It was on the trail ahead of him, but he never could shortcut it to get it. And by God, it was summertime, and when he got on, he was just about all in. And they had to get the police boat up and take him down to Casville, and he withered away then. And after that, he wasn't the same guy. He was stooped. He didn't look rugged. He looked like an old man. And that's the last time I seen him. I saw him here in town, and he still wanted to go up to the Lavina. But while he was, well, I'll finish that after. But while he was there at Argenta, you see, the war come on, and he had a bunch of guns. And old Bob Gilker, he was a provincial, and he thought he'd do them natives a good turn, you know, by going around and registering their handguns and rifles and tell them, see what they had. By God, he went into Red, and Red turned a gun on him. Yeah, by God, Gilker told me this himself. And he said, I never was so scared in my life. He said, that guy, he said, when he pulled that gun off the rack and turned it on me, he said he could look right through me. His eyes were just like steel. Yeah. But Red told me one time, the last time I saw him here in town, he was pretty well broke down. He still wanted to go to the Lavina. And he asked me if I had any guns. I said, yeah. He said, I would like to have a gun. I'd like to go back up to the Lavina again. And he said to me, did you ever shoot a man? I said, not a civilian knife. He said, I shot 3. He never said he killed them, but he said, I shot 3.